Hi, and good evening again, or whatever time it is where you are and when you're watching this video, whether it's just 10 minutes after it was released or whether it's 50 years after it was released. It's amazing to think that, these videos, just like the ebooks I wrote on the other website, besttellingauthor.com, it's amazing to think that, they could actually outlive me, and let's actually hope that they do, you know. But at the same time, that I hopefully live a good long life, but that these videos and ebooks still outlive me, if you know what I mean. But yes, okay, so today's talk video, or this talk video, especially whether it is morning, afternoon, evening, or night your time, is this the world in the year 2099? Now, I must be specific on what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the climate, in terms of climate change or the way the world looks physically, if you like. So, not talking about politically or socially or economics or different demographics or different countries and their influence and their power over the rest of the world or population, anything like that. Talking specifically about climate. Now, in terms of climate change, and from the studying that I have done of it, and I've actually pretty much studied climate change all the way since I first read about it as a kid. I still remember we now call it climate change. Before that we called it global warming, and before that it was the greenhouse effect. You might remember. And they had found out about climate change back in the 50s. And then by the 70s, they had done a lot of research about what would happen if we kept going the way we were going in terms of burning fossil fuels and our carbon emissions. And then in the 80s, they pushed for action to be done. They pushed for action to be done, and they actually created the intergovernmental panel, on climate change. You'd think that it was made more recently, but it was actually made back in the 80s, and they pushed for action to be taken. Unfortunately, it wasn't. And the main culprits, I remember reading in a book called Losing Earth. I remember reading it that the main culprits in that at the time in the 80s were the superpowers at the time, being the US, the Soviet Union, and Britain. A big culprit in that was George H.W. Bush. And of course, like father, like son, his son, George W. Bush, didn't give a crap about climate change and didn't do much for it. In fact, much the opposite. So unfortunately, we kept going the way we were going from the 80s and now till today. Sorry, I'm not so sure if I said it earlier, but today is the 14th of May, 2026. The 14th of May 2026, and my apologies if I've forgotten. I'm Hirsch Saha reporting from Auckland, New Zealand, as usual. So, what happened is that we put ourselves on a course the way we are today. And when I remember researching climate change myself, I foresaw three possible scenarios. Of course, others, especially scientists, climate scientists. I'm not a meteorologist, a scientist who studies the weather. I'm certainly not a climate scientist. But those who do study it in much more depth than I do, and who have much more experience in the field than I do, they could argue there's even more scenarios than what I'm going to tell you today. Keep that in mind. But I think what I'll give you today is still a very good broad picture of what is likely to happen, the way we're going now, and with what we know about now, or pretty much at present. So, from my research, I foresaw three possibilities or three scenarios with the way things are going when it comes to climate change. One is that, you get rising sea levels from the melting ice caps because the average temperature of the world increases when there's more carbon emitted in the atmosphere, there's more CO2. At the dawn, pre-industrialization, roughly about close to 200 years ago, the industrial age basically started in 1837 with the invention of the steam train locomotive in 1837. So, say about 180 or so years, or actually more like close to 190 years ago, that is pretty much when industrialization started. And pre-industrialization, the balance of carbon in our atmosphere was about 280 parts per million. 280 parts per million. Today, it is about, last I looked at it, it's about 415 parts per million. It's probably actually a bit more than that now. So it has gone up by a fair bit from 280 to 415 parts per million in less than 200 years. And the average temperature of the world has increased by approximately, from what I last looked at, 1.2 degrees Celsius since pre-industrialization, and we've already passed the point of no return for 1 degree warming. We're now at about 1.2 degrees warming. But if we keep going the way we're going, they say we will pass the point of no return for 1.5 degrees warming by 2030, possibly even as soon as 2027. That's just next year. And of course, scientists believe that if we go any higher than 1.5 degrees warming, if the average temperature of the world increases by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above that of pre-industrial times, it will be horrible. It'll be catastrophic, and that is obviously not good. And I hate to think, but that's probably where we're headed. That is probably where we're headed. From my research, I saw three possible scenarios of what's happening with climate change. One is, and it's already happening, rising sea levels, melting ice, more extreme weather, more often, for longer, and in more places. You know, warming temperatures and more floods, more droughts. And really affecting our global supply chain, not just human beings, but virtually all species of plant and animal on the planet. That is already happening, unfortunately. That first scenario is already happening. But going even forward from now, from if you like 14th of May 2026, or from 2026 forward, I see two other scenarios. The first is, if you remember, just happen to have a copy of the DVD right here. If you remember that 2004 movie, this is now 2020, 22 years ago, if I can actually get it right. This is 22 years ago, believe it or not. And I remember seeing it in the theaters with my father, who took me to it. But that 2004 movie called The Day After Tomorrow, which told about a global superstorm happening. And the movie, despite having great special effects, especially for the time, the movie was, from what I heard, actually a flop. A lot of us walked out of the cinemas, you might remember, thinking, what? And scratching our heads? How come it all happened in one day? What was that? And my opinion was always, if they had just explained it better towards the beginning of the movie, people would have understood it much more. But really, what happened in this movie was this, and it was actually a repeat of what has happened in the past, a global superstorm. If you look at it, obviously the poles of the Earth are a little bit further away from the sun than the equator, right? And therefore they're a bit colder. And as you know, the Earth, as it orbits around the sun, it's not a perfect orbit. The Earth wobbles a bit, and that's what contributes to coming and going ice ages. Sometimes the Earth is a little closer to the sun, the ice melts, sea levels rise, like we are today. The ice we have in northern Canada, northern Russia, Greenland, that's ice left over from the last ice age. Sometimes the Earth is a little bit closer to the sun, the ice melts, sea levels rise, it's a more temperate climate like it is today. Sometimes the Earth is a bit further away from the sun, more ice forms, sea levels drop, and you've got more ice towards the pole, and towards the equator it's more temperate. So the Day After Tomorrow, that 2004 movie, showed was a reconstruction of what's actually happened in the past. As you know, sunlight will hit the Earth at the equator, right? And if you like, vertically, 1 kilometer of sunlight, if I can do this properly, hits 1 kilometer of land or sea. But as you move closer to the North or South poles, the Earth curves, right? So then that same 1 kilometer of sunlight is divided. It's perhaps 3 kilometers of land or sea, or perhaps 5 kilometers of land or sea. That same 1 kilometer of sunlight, the light and the heat is divided. Therefore, that's another reason why it's colder at the poles than it is at the equator. Not just because the poles happen to be a little further away from the sun than the equator. So what actually happens today is that you have, ocean currents, and there's that the North Atlantic current. Sunlight hits the Earth at the equator, and the water currents carry the heat north to the northern hemisphere. Apparently, scientists believe the northern hemisphere should actually be in an ice age right now, but it's not because of those water currents that carry the heat to the northern hemisphere and gives it its temperate climate. And what had happened in the distant past in the last ice age was that there was a huge inland sea that spanned southern Canada and what is now southern Canada and what is now the northern United States. A huge inland sea. And when that sea eventually swept out to the ocean and drained to the ocean around through New York, around there, that added a lot of fresh water to the North Atlantic Ocean. Now, believe it or not, it's seawater that is stable. It is fresh, less salty or desalinated water that is less stable. You'd think it's the other way around, but actually, seawater is more stable than fresh water. So, when that fresh water came into the North Atlantic Ocean, that disturbed that current, and that current slowed down or shut off. And there was a huge global superstorm. And that put Europe into an ice age. And they had evidence of where mammoths were just frozen solid right where they were, dead in their tracks. And that is what it shows in this movie, The Day After Tomorrow, from ice melting from Greenland, and it is melting very quickly. Ice melting from Greenland is sending a lot of fresh water into the North Atlantic Ocean, disturbing that North Atlantic current, and if it slows down or switches off, then there'll be a global superstorm lasting about 7 to 10 days, as you saw in the movie, and that would leave the Northern Hemisphere in an ice age. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but that is what that movie showed, and that actually has happened in the past. That what used to be that inland sea between what is now southern Canada and the northern United States, the Great Lakes, such as Lake Michigan and all that, the Great Lakes are the remnant of that, what was once a huge inland sea. The Great Lakes are the remnant of that, or the remnants of that, sorry. So that is scenario two. Scenario one is already happening, melting ice, rising sea level, more extreme weather more often. And that's already happening. That is scenario two, a global superstorm and a new so called ice age. Now, scenario three is actually what is now more likely to happen from the research I've done. And this is what I've read, and I know that this is actually quite an old edition of the New Scientist magazine. If you can see it there, it is coming out in 28 February 2009. So it is, what does that make it, about 17 and a bit years, 17 years and 3 months old. But what it detailed is something which is still a theory today and which is still quite well regarded today. And what it is basically this. If average temperatures continue to increase, what will happen is that you will have more desertification, and the deserts of the earth will more pretty much cover the land that is between the Tropic of Cancer and above the Tropic of Capricorn, if you know what I mean. And the land closer towards the poles in the far north and the far south, those lands will become more temperate, but the lands in between will pretty much become too hot and turn to desert. As the cover of the magazine says, Earth 2099, or basically 2100, this is what it predicts. Population crashes, mass migration, vast new deserts, as I mentioned, cities abandoned. And what the article shows, and I found it just fascinating, and again, it still has implications today, is that this is what they believe the world would look like in 2099. So this is based on an average temperature increase of 4 degrees and an average sea level rise of 2 meters. Of course, the average sea level rise could very well be higher than that. If just Greenland melts, sea levels will rise by about 6 to 7 meters. If just the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica, which is a huge ice shelf that is currently slipping off the continent because of melting ice, it's an ice shelf the size of France. If just that Ross Ice Shelf comes off the land, off the Antarctica and into the ocean, just that alone will raise sea levels by about 6 to 7 meters again. So think if there's a combination, if there's both Greenland and the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica, that could raise sea levels by 12 to 14 meters together, or perhaps something in between. And remember that when ice in the water melts, sea levels actually don't rise when the ice in the water icebergs and water melts, because that's how water is. Even though ice is a solid, you think it's more dense, but when it melts, it actually isn't more in volume. It's when ice from Antarctica or from Greenland coming off the land melts into the sea, it contributes to the sea, and therefore sea levels rise. But what this is showing, as you'll see, is that basically below the Tropic of Cancer, pretty much, and above the Tropic of Capricorn, more or less, you have mass desertification. And the areas north and south of that becoming green. So look at that, you've got northern Canada, a bit of Greenland, pretty much what is Russia, and northern Europe. But everything below that pretty much turning to desert, apart from the southern tip of South America, a bit of Australia, and even my home country, New Zealand. What is interesting is that they show a pretty large part of Antarctica becoming green. I'm not entirely sure that is correct, because remember, in Antarctica, summer is one long day and winter is one long night. So I'm not sure if that would be the best for plants. They need pretty much a 24-hour normal day and night cycle. Day for about 12 hours, night for approximately the other 12 hours. So I'm not sure if that is actually correct, that if that ice melts from Antarctica, that part of Antarctica would turn green when summer is one long day and winter is one long night. I'm not sure if that is actually correct. What the article shows is that there'll be mass migration where people will have to move from closer to the equator to the far north and the far south. Again, I'm not sure if that's correct, because I don't think countries will coordinate with each other and cooperate that well. Usually, in these circumstances, countries will just look out for themselves, and that in many ways is actually understandable. That is basically what countries do today, right now. So I'm not sure if that is entirely correct, but it gives you an idea of what the world could be like in 2099. Possibly even sooner than that, keep in mind. I do remember one scene from the 2004 movie The Day After Tomorrow, and I'll never forget it was when you had the global superstorm and a new ice age, and ice was covering most of the United States. In that movie, people were fleeing from the United States and illegally crossing the border into Mexico. And the Mexican president in the movie said, "Oh, when we were poor and vulnerable and desperately needed help, and you were rich," he said to the president of the United States in the movie, "when we were poor and needed help and you were rich, were you there for us? No. So why should we be there for you when it's the opposite, when the tables have turned?" And I have to admit, that is actually a bit of a fair point. He's only looking out for his own people in his country, you could argue. But then you'll probably laugh at this. But in the movie, Day After Tomorrow, the president of the United States said, "Okay, okay, okay. If you let our American refugees," never thought you'd hear that term, right? "If you let our American refugees cross the border and come into Mexico, we will forgive all Latin American debt." And then the president of Mexico was like, "Oh yeah, let them through, let them through, let them through." And yes, we might laugh at that, but that's actually what could happen in that situation if it really went that far. But yes, so from the research I have done, and from the books I have read, the movies I've watched, the documentaries I've watched, the magazine articles I've read, what I've heard about, what I've discussed with other people, what I've thought about myself, that is what I foresee the world being, or potentially being, in the year 2099. Maybe not a global superstorm and the northern hemisphere covered in ice like on this movie, but something more like what you saw in this New Scientist magazine article around 2100, or if you like 2099. That is potentially what the world will look like. So maybe think about where you, or maybe more importantly, where your children and grandchildren might choose to settle, especially if things get worse and we are headed closer, and are headed closer and closer to that. So certainly food for thought, and thank you for watching once again. Feel free to like this video, comment on it, hopefully positively. Let me know anything I might have missed, or anything I've got wrong, or anything else you have to say. Always much appreciated, always learning, always progressing. That's how you move forward in life. And of course, feel free to subscribe to the channel, and feel free to pass it on to others. Thank you very much. Take care. All the best.